What's up, Acty people? So in this video, I'm going to be dropping the whole drivetrain out of this thing. And I go over that in great detail, step by step. I also go over the steps to just remove the transmission, leaving the engine in it if you need to do a clutch. So hopefully this is helpful to you. I know it would have been helpful to me before I started. While I had the drivetrain out, I also did a timing belt and water pump and fuel filter and valve cover gasket and distributor O-ring, clutch, pilot bearing, several things that I go over in the video, so that'll probably be helpful too. I'll also mention to you the best method to drop the engine out of this thing is to just jack the back of the vehicle up, put it on some nice tall jack stands, chock the front wheels so it doesn't roll, and then use an engine hoist and come up in here. And the Acty drivetrain actually has some really great hoist points right on top, easy to access. So do that, lower it down. When you lower it down, put it on something nice and flat. The bottom of the Acty drivetrain is not flat. The oil pan looks flat, but it's really kind of wobbly once you set it on something. So I recommend putting it on something as wide and flat as you possibly can. I used a wheel dolly with just some 2x6s on top of it. Or you could use one of those little wooden dollies that you can get at Harbor Freight or Northern or whatever you got near you. So yeah, I think that covers all the intro stuff, so let's go ahead and get started. Chock your wheels, obviously, and I find the most secure method to do this is to put the chocks in place like this and then have someone rock the vehicle back and forth, and on a forward rock, kick the one behind it back in a little bit tighter, and then it'll really be in there tight. So to drop the trans or the drivetrain, you want to drain both of these. The drain plug for the trans is right here on the right hand side. There's the oil drain, and go ahead and get both of those draining out. If you're taking the whole drivetrain out, it's time to go up front and drain the coolant. First, we're going to go underneath the glove box and take this under cover out of the way, and then under another cover is your radiator cap. All right, let's go to the back again. Now that the oil's drained out, we're going to take this oil filter off because we need to take this one bolt out while we're here. This is the only bolt on the underside of the transmission. In fact, on the whole bottom half of the transmission is just this one bolt. So go ahead and take that out now. If you're dropping the drivetrain, we're going to move that coolant drain pan back here and get some more coolant out of these hoses. And there's also a drain plug on the block. All right, so now we're going to take the exhaust out only if you're removing the transmission. If you are removing the whole drivetrain, go ahead and take the exhaust and the intake out before you take the axle out. To remove the exhaust, there's just these two nuts at the flange right here and a hanger there and a second rubber hanger. There's a third one that you can't really see in this video, and two rubber hoses which provide heat to the intake. As long as you soak the rubber hangers down with PP Blaster, the exhaust isn't that big a deal to remove. All right, so the intake is kind of hard to get video of. It's tight in there, and there's a lot of vacuum lines coming from all angles. I would just recommend that you look at it from all angles. Look at it from up top, look at it from the wheel well. There's some vacuum lines that are easier to get from there rather than underneath. There's also a couple hidden bolts on it. If you take all the bolts out and you're tugging on it and it's not coming down, you probably missed one. There's also a hose right here that goes from the oil filler cap to the engine that you have to remove. Okay, now that we've got the exhaust off the vehicle, we need to get the CV axles out. The way to do that is to disconnect the whole axle assembly from the vehicle so that you've got enough play there, and you could take the whole axle assembly and kind of tilt it and pop one CV axle out and then tilt it the other way, pop that CV axle out. I also recommend that you disconnect the brake line at the back and then just drop the whole thing out. There's two screws holding the emergency brake cables right up here. Take those two out, and then you can push the whole axle in front of the jack stands that you have set up. and you'll have tons of room to work with. Now, the only caveat with that is you might want to check your brake bleeders first. If they're rusted up and frozen, then you might want to figure out how to do this with the axle in place. But if they're not frozen, they break open freely, by all means, just get the whole CV axle off. It takes like 5 minutes. Push it in front of the jack stands. First thing to do is disconnect the brake line. Next, we need to support the axle before we disconnect it. Ideally, you would put 2 jacks under the ends of each CV axle. If you only have 1 jack, you can make that work. Take 4 nuts off this plate and the shock bolt out. They're all 14 millimeters. And underneath that plate was a 12 millimeter nut. That bolt holds the leaf springs to the axle. Remove that. All right, the only thing connecting the solid axle to the drivetrain is the CV axles now. So with one side drooping, we can pry on it, pop the CV axle out, go over to the other side and do the same thing. 2 out of 3 of the motor mounts on this thing are on the transmission. So what we're going to do next is put a jack underneath the transmission and get those 2 motor mounts off. Then we can tilt that side of the drivetrain down so it's easy to access all the connections that are left on the transmission that we need to get off. And then we're going to jack it back up, put a jack stand under the engine, and then we can pull the transmission off. So on the motor mount that's on the front of the transmission, you just take the single big bolt out. That's it. On this one back here, because the transmission is going to come out in this direction, we need to take this whole bracket off and this bracket that connects to the exhaust. All the bolts in this circle right here, take it out, remove all that stuff. And while you're down here, you can go ahead and unplug this connector. Now's a good time as well to go ahead and disconnect the speedo cable and this shifter cable. They're right above the CV axle holes. In this same area is this little plate, just got 2 bolts in it, but it's connecting the transmission to the engine. So remove that, and there's a vacuum line right above it that you've probably already disconnected from the intake, but just take a look at that. There's 2 more cables up top, a shifter cable and a clutch cable, and they're underneath this vacuum hose, so you have to move that out the way. You're probably going to do that right there at that PCV valve, and when I did, it broke. I was able to create a new one using these 2 part numbers, so just be wary of that. Once you've got those 2 cables off, now we can move on to disconnecting electrical stuff. Okay, so now at the battery compartment, if you're just dropping the transmission, all you need to do is disconnect the positive battery cable so that you can safely disconnect the positive at the starter. For the drivetrain, you're going to need to disconnect the negative, and you should do that at the engine. It's 1 bolt next to this water outlet. For the positive, you're going to want the harness to come out of the battery box and drop that down with the drivetrain. So you're going to take the positive cable and these 2 wires that are on this terminal underneath this plate right here. Take those loose, feed that back. That's going to come out with the drivetrain. This is that harness from the battery that we need to remove and pull it back. And as you can see up underneath here, there's zip ties holding it in place. We need to also disconnect these 2 big connectors and the little green clips that hold the harness itself to the body. Okay, now we can disconnect everything from the transmission. Because I did this with the drivetrain out, I'm not sure if it's going to be easier for you right now from up top or underneath. You got the jack in place so you can lower it if you need to. But you're going to take this L-shaped harness, disconnect everything from the transmission. There's a few things that are going to stay connected to the engine. They go up underneath over here. So just leave those there. Disconnect the rest, and then just flip this up and onto the engine and out of your way. Here's what it looks like with everything out of the way, even the starter removed. One of the starter bolts does go through to the engine. And we are ready to go ahead and take the bolts out of the transmission and drop it out. First, we need to go ahead and get the engine on a jack stand. Set a piece of wood or something on top of the jack stand. Don't set it right up underneath the oil pan. All right, these are the bolt holes that we've got to access. Obviously that bottom one we already removed in an earlier step, but as long as you've got that jack stand under the engine and a jack underneath the transmission to support it, you can access these bolts, get them loose, and then shimmy the transmission away from the engine and drop it out. All right, I didn't plan on going into great detail about replacing the clutch, because if you're doing all this on an Acty, I'm assuming you've replaced a clutch before, but I will tell you to get the throwout bearing out. On this little rod right here, you simply take this 1 little bolt out, you slide that shaft up, and then you can replace it. Just a note about the clutch replacement. My clutch kit did not come with a pilot bearing or an alignment dowel for it, but you can find the bearing anywhere. The part number's on the screen right now, and the alignment dowel, you can 3D print it. It's available on the website Thingiverse. And here's a quick recap of everything that you should have just removed. All right, boys and girls, let's move on to what it takes to drop the whole drivetrain out. And the first step that's different from the transmission is, let's go ahead and evacuate the air conditioning. The fittings are down here in the corner. Just some tips on removing vacuum lines. Chances are all the vacuum lines you're going to remove have been frozen. This is not one you're going to remove, by the way. But most of them have been on these pipes for decades and they've never been removed, so they are stuck on there pretty good. Your best bet is to get you a pair of pliers with some teeth on it, so it'll grab the rubber good. Something like that, not something like this. And you want to grab the vacuum line and work it back and forth until it breaks free. And then one like this. These are good for this number right here. Yeah, see? Yeah, so that's helpful. If you have one that's really stuck, also a pick like this can help you get in sometimes. It doesn't work too great on smaller ones because it's hard to get in there underneath the real small ones. But yeah, it's helpful to have the right tools for this because you're going to be doing that numerous times. Okay, so you're going to have to pull this cover off to get to the throttle cable right here, to get to the end of it and disconnect that. This cover's got to come off to do that, and it's kind of dumb because these vacuum lines right here, this is a cap that comes off, and there's 3 screws, one over here, one over here, one down here. These vacuum lines, if this was just a cutout underneath, you could just pull this cap off, but it's not. It goes around these vacuum lines, so you've got to pull these out. You got to pull that one out, pull that one out, pull that one out, before you can get that cap off and get the throttle cable loose. This vacuum hose right here, got to come loose. This red line right here is a fuel line. That's got to come loose right there. That is not the fuel filter right there. Fuel filter is further ahead, underneath the vehicle. It's right underneath the sliding door right there. If you look up, you can see it. All of those vacuum hoses have to get disconnected, of course. Label them thoroughly. Label each end, what you pull off and the end it came from. Some of them have T's in them, so there's a couple different ways you can disconnect it. Just make sure you label it. And there's 2 bigger vacuum hoses underneath there. Of course, you can see a ground wire right there behind it. In the same area, there's a coolant hose you've got to take loose. Now that you've evacuated the AC system down, we need to disconnect the lines. I recommend disconnecting them right here because they run underneath the intake, so you can't really disconnect them at the compressor. And now we gotta remove these 2 brackets because if you don't, you're not gonna have enough play to separate these 2 AC lines. And these are the sizes that you're gonna need to disconnect those lines. It's a 22, 24, and 27. So the coil pack here was the last thing that I disconnected. It was the most difficult to reach. It's off this front corner of the engine cover behind the driver's seat. You access it from underneath. It's just tight under there. It's above the exhaust. Just so you know what you're looking at, you're gonna have 2 connectors like this one where you squeeze them to disconnect. And then 2 of these black ones, which don't even really look like connectors, but they pull apart. So yeah, it's not complicated, it's just in a tight to reach spot. Well, the coil pack was the last thing I had to remove before I could drop it down, so you should pretty much be there at this point. Go ahead and get your engine hoist in place. Get the chains hooked up to the top of the engine, get your dolly in place, and take the motor mounts out, lower it down onto it. I do recommend you have some shims of some sort. I use hockey pucks to put underneath the engine to kind of keep it level from rocking around. But other than that, you're ready to drop it on the ground and roll it out of the way. While I had the drivetrain out, I went ahead and prepared for seat belts. I want to install some seat belts for that second row of seats because this is a van, obviously. So let me show you what I did while I had the engine out of the way to get ready for that. This is part of the seatbelt kit that I got. There's the part number on your screen. There's two of these, and so you can see where the armrest is. This is going to go up under it. So, and with the curve on it, I need to pretty much end up right there with one and right there with one. That means I need these things to bolt to an L bracket here and here. Now, I've looked underneath, and there's some things on the frame rail over here, but I'm pretty clear right in here and right in here. So I'm going to put a thick bracket across there with L brackets coming off, and I'm going to weld nuts up underneath here and here so that when I'm not using the seat belts, I can pull these bolts out, and I'll put plugs on there so there's no exhaust or anything coming in. But yeah, I'm going to put a bracket across here, bolts through here, two like 1/2 inch bolts, something really beefy. But what that should do is allow me to pull the bolts out and pull the bracket out so that when I'm not cruising around with the seat belts, I don't need to have this big bracket that's like obstructing the whole cargo area. You know what I mean? So yeah, let's do it. So here's where the holes ended up going for that, as seen from up top. And I had to remove these two units, this like evap or idle assembly, I'm not sure what that unit is right there, and then this the hard lines assembly for vacuum lines. That's where the holes came out at the bottom, and to get clearance for where I wanted the nuts to be welded in place, I had to trim a little bit off the brackets on that edge right there, and then the edge of this hard vacuum line assembly. And you can see where it cleared. I could have cut that vacuum line assembly a little bit better, but anyways, my welds don't look great, but it's just to hold the nuts in place so I can get big long bolts down there and hold my seatbelt bracket in place. Okay, let's get to the parts that I replaced, starting with this motor mount. It was obvious when I dropped the drivetrain that this motor mount was bad and just cracked and dried out, but then when I finally got a new one and compared it to the old one, I didn't realize that the bushing was pulling out and actually causing my engine to sag a little bit on this one side. It was about 5/8 lower than it should have been. So you might want to look at yours and make sure that the bushing is centered up inside there. So the fuel filter is in a tricky spot here up above the spare tire in that area. It's hard to reach, but I do recommend you replace it. This is the nastiness that I got out of mine. It's got two clips on the side. You're supposed to be able to squeeze and pull the fuel filter up and out. I could not squeeze the one that was on the inboard side of the filter towards the middle of the vehicle. Instead, I took a flathead and I bent the thin metal that's holding it in place. I just bent it away so I didn't have to squeeze the clip, lifted it out. Once the new one was in, I just bent that little piece of sheet metal back. I replaced the valve cover gasket too because it was just pouring oil onto the exhaust manifold, and it's just like any other valve cover gasket. Really the only thing you need to know is put a little dab of RTV in the corners where it goes over the cams. But when I was done, there was still a leak left, and it was this, looked like this right here, which was the distributor O-ring. And I will tell you, an O-ring that is compatible is the cam angle sensor O-ring for a 1990 to 1997 Mazda Miata. I replaced the serpentine belts and the timing belt while I was doing this, but I'm not really going to include that in this video because there's plenty of videos about that. When I did all these repairs, I really took my time, and what I ended up doing was bolting the axle back into place without the drivetrain in it so I could just push the vehicle outside. And this is how I kept the CV axles from dragging around on the ground. Just use some really big zip ties, put them around it, and then they'll be able to hang there and spin as you push the vehicle around. Reinstalling the drivetrain in the Acty is essentially the reverse of removal. Just a couple tips on that though. Bleeding the cooling system's a pain in the butt. You're going to get very little air out at the radiator cap. Most of it's going to come out of bleeder ports. So once you've started it up, the first thing you're going to want to do is crack the bleeders underneath the vehicle on the heater hoses. They're right in front of the engine. You can see them from up top with the engine cover off. Once you've got solid coolant out of those, then you're going to continue to bleed at the intake on these two bleeders. And you're just going to have to repeat this process over and over. Start the vehicle, crack those bleeders, wait till you have a solid stream of coolant, close them, shut it off. Then physically shake the vehicle. It actually says that in the manual. It says to shake the vehicle to get the air bubbles to go to the top. Start it again, crack the bleeders, and just repeat. I ended up leaving tools in the back of my van because after I did this a couple times, it stopped overheating, and I just ran errands with it, and then when I was done, I would pull the cover off and crack the bleeders again. I just did it probably an excessive amount of times, but you can't do it too much. And you should know that when you're refilling it with coolant, this void around the radiator cap right here kind of acts like a funnel that just dumps coolant outside of the vehicle. It just pours out the bottom. So if you spill some, no worries. You're not going to soak the carpet or something like that. It's just going to spill out underneath the vehicle. If you drop the whole drivetrain, you drained the transmission, the engine, and the refrigerant out of it. So these are your capacities and the specs for the fluids that go back in it. Here's one more little tip for a reassembly. What you want to do is take this cap off. Again, this is for all vehicles. Take the cap off. There's a little dimple in the end of it. What you don't want to do is just take a hammer to it and start smashing, and then you mushroom the head of your CV axle, and then you've just screwed yourself. You want to take a ball peen hammer and put that in the little dimple that's in there. Again, once you take the cap off, and then you want to smack the ball peen hammer with your hammer so that this stays centered up in the dimple and you don't mushroom the head of your CV axle. Another thing I encountered as I was going back together is when I went to adjust the slack in the clutch cable, I found that I was missing a little rubber bumper above the clutch pedal. And ever since I've had this thing, I felt like the clutch pedal was high as shit. It made my size 9.5s feel like 14s, and it just was awkward, and I could never keep my foot off of the clutch. Well, let me tell you, just replacing this rubber bumper has made a world of difference. So I would check and see if yours has that. Last but not least, I also added some insulation while I had everything pulled apart. Yes, it did make a difference. And I've still got some places I can add some. I will tell you, this type that I got, it's not like Dynamat, it's kind of a foam padding. You cannot reposition it at all because it's foam. Once it sticks, if you try to move it, it's just going to tear. So for that style, I recommend that you apply it in very small sections because repositioning just isn't possible. Well, I hope this video has been helpful to you in working on your Acty, dropping the drivetrain, doing a clutch, or any of the other things that I mentioned in here. I tried to pack as much into the video as I could, as quickly as I could. Some other great resources to work on these is Rob Robinette's website. If you haven't checked that out, go do that. He's got a lot of great info on there. It's a very thorough website. Also, there's an English translated service manual that you absolutely have to own if you own one of these. And there is a Honda Acty group Facebook page that you should also join, where you can talk to other people who have them and ask them questions and stuff. I will be posting on that Facebook page hashtag parts list, look for that, a spreadsheet that I've made of US available parts that are compatible with the Acty. So that should be very helpful working on your Acty. If I do any other work on this thing, I will try and make YouTube videos about it and post those. I should also mention that I know once I post this video, I'm gonna think, oh man, I missed something, or I should have mentioned this, or so I'll make comments underneath the video and put links in there and stuff like that. So I think that's about it for this job. This was actually a distraction from putting a V6 in my Miata, so I'm gonna get back to that so I can get back on track. Peace out.